If you use ChatGPT regularly, the habits you develop don't just show who is really doing the thinking, they can change it. I had developed several habits without even realizing. So today, I want to look at the habits shaping my conversations because noticing mine might help you noticing your own. I have also collected the habits and the phrases I use in a free download that you can find in the description. Over the past 6 months, I have made videos about asking better questions, challenging AI's answers, and not accepting the first response. But when I look back at my own conversations, I started seeing those ideas as part of a larger pattern. Staying in the driver's seat while working with AI isn't one big decision I make before opening my ChatGPT. It happens during all the smaller choices I make during the conversation, where the conversation begins, what I question, what I keep, what I change, and what I decide to leave behind. I started to thinking of these as conversation moves. This is not 5 steps I use in every conversation. Sometimes I use one or two. Sometimes I repeat the same move several times or go backwards because something no longer fits. This isn't a method I deliberately designed. This is a pattern I noticed after working with ChatGPT for a really long time. The first habit is that I usually bring something of my own. I rarely begin by asking ChatGPT what I should explore or what I should make. I almost always arrive with something I already have in my head. It might be an observation, an idea, a question, a doubt, or simply something that doesn't make sense yet. It doesn't have to be fully formed. Sometimes, or most of the times, the fact that it isn't fully formed is the reason I bring it to ChatGPT. My conversation often begins with phrases like, I've been thinking, or something has been bothering me. There is nothing automatically wrong with asking ChatGPT for ideas. I do that too. But I've noticed that beginning with something of my own makes it easier for me to stay intentional about where the conversation starts. If ChatGPT brings the first idea, I begin by responding to its direction and its framing. That doesn't mean I have given up control. I can still reject that idea, questioning it, or change it completely. But it does change my starting point. When I bring something on my own, ChatGPT can help me develop it without deciding what the conversation should be about in the first place. And at this point, I usually don't even look for an answer yet. I'm bringing something to ChatGPT that I want to think about. The conversation starts with me, not with AI. Once the idea is there, we start exploring. At this point, I'm still not looking for answers. I'm trying to understand. This is where the fun begins. I start twisting ChatGPT's responses, bending my own thinking, challenging assumptions, and following unexpected ideas to see where they lead. The first response is rarely the end of anything. Sometimes I challenge ChatGPT. Sometimes I ask it to challenge me. Sometimes a response make me reconsider what I thought. And sometimes the conversation ends up somewhere I had never expected. This might sound like regular brainstorming, and in some ways it is. People have always explored ideas, made connections, and changed directions while thinking. The difference is that ChatGPT responds. It offers possibilities immediately. It fills in gaps. It creates connections and gives structure to thoughts that may still be messy in my own head. And that can be very useful. It can also create momentum before I have decided if I want to follow this direction. A response can feel complete enough that I stop exploring. Or it can introduce a frame that quietly shapes every question after this. That is why my side of the conversation often includes phrases like, wait, actually, maybe that's not the real question. Those little interruption matters. They stop the conversation from being a straight line from my question to ChatGPT's answer. Sometimes the original question disappears completely, and I have learned not to fight that. If the conversation uncovers a better answer or a more interesting direction, I would rather follow that than force my original idea. I treat these conversations as a place of thinking, not as a place of getting answers. After exploring an idea for a while, I often have pages of conversations. There might be several useful ideas, unexpected connections, and things I want to remember. But interesting isn't the same as understandable. At some point, I stop exploring and start looking for clarity. Sometimes that means simplifying what we have talked about. Sometimes it means separating ideas that have been tangled. I'm not just trying to make the conversation shorter. I'm trying to see the structure underneath it. This is when I start asking questions such as, what is the common thread? Or can you simplify this? Sometimes we go from pages of conversation to 5 ideas to one, and this can make the whole conversation easier to see. But it is also where I have to be careful. ChatGPT is very good at making messy material look coherent. It can create a neat pattern even when the conversation contains several ideas that don't quite go together. A clear summary can also make it feel like I understand something because it's now easy to read. So I have to look at the pattern ChatGPT gives me. Does it really fit? What got lost when I compressed the conversation? Were we actually exploring one idea, or has ChatGPT made several ideas look like one? Reaching one clear idea doesn't mean that I understand it. It gives me something I can question, test, remember, and try to explain in my own words. I don't simplify to think less. I simplify so I can think more clearly. At some point, I shift from exploring the idea to deciding what it will become. Now I start making choices about the final work. What belongs, what doesn't, what deserves more attention, and what should disappear completely. Sometimes I'm editing the words, but more often I'm editing the direction, the argument, the structure, and the message. This is where my part of the conversation start to sound like, that's not my voice. That is becoming a tutorial. That is not the real point. Those responses are not interruption to the work. They are part of the work. ChatGPT might have suggested a structure or written a sentence that helps me see the idea differently. It might have influenced the direction in ways I would never have reached alone. I'm not pretending that that influence disappears because I make the final decision, but I am still deciding what I am willing to keep, develop, and eventually put my name on. AI suggests. I make the decision. Taking ownership doesn't mean that I have to protect the idea I started. I rarely finish with exact the same idea that I started. And I think that is one of the main reasons why these conversations can be valuable. For example, this video didn't begin as a conversation about my workflow. It began as a simple idea of sharing a few things I have learned while working with ChatGPT, a collection of tips. But as we explored, I realized that the tips wasn't the real idea. The pattern behind my conversations were much more interesting. The same thing has happened with many of my other videos. The questions I started with wasn't always the question I ended up answering. At some point, I find myself saying, I think that's the video, or that's the real idea. Allowing the idea to change is an active choice. I could keep pulling the conversation back to my original idea simply because it was my idea. But staying in the driver's seat doesn't mean that I have to follow the route I originally planned. It means I decide whether the new direction is worth following, because a different direction isn't automatically a better one. Sometimes ChatGPT creates an interesting detour that has very little to do with what I was trying to understand. Sometimes the new idea sounds better because the language is smoother. And sometimes the conversation reveals that I started with the wrong question. I have stopped expecting to end where I started. I don't have to defend my first idea. I have to decide whether the new idea is a stronger one. Looking back, I don't think I consciously decided to work this way. These habits developed over hundreds, maybe even thousands of conversations, and they don't all of them appear every time. Some conversations begin with something I already understand quite well, so there isn't much exploration. Some stays messy for a very long time because I'm not ready to simplify them. Sometimes I feel I have reached a final idea and then go all the way back because something doesn't feel quite right. These are conversation moves, not steps in a system, but together they have made me notice something. Staying in the driver's seat, it happens through all the smaller moves I make along the way. What I bring in, what I question, what I keep, what I change, and what I decide to leave behind. And if you would like to look more closely at your own conversations compared to what I've talked about, you will find the conversation moves and phrases in the link in the description where I have put together a PDF. But making this video also made me realize something else. Today, I have spent time paying attention to my habits. But I'm not the only one bringing habits to these conversations. ChatGPT has habits too. Not habits developed from talking to me, but patterns built into how it responds. For example, to be helpful, to keep the conversation moving, to smooth over disagreements, and sometimes even stubbornly try to get the last word. If understanding my own habits helped me stay in the driver's seat, understanding ChatGPT's habits might be just as important. And that's where my exploration will take me next. So, in my next video, we will take a look at what habits or patterns are built into ChatGPT. And I hope you will be back here next week for that video. If you enjoyed today's video, a thumbs up and maybe even a subscription would be appreciated. And share your own experiences in the comments below. Bye.